Sabrina 70s comic issue 4. We started out seeing Hilda and Zelda making a potion, not embarrassed to be wearing the same color clothing because they're just that close. I like that when Hilda said the most stereotypical witch line ever, the writing was self-aware enough to have Sabrina explain where the line actually came from. The fourth act of Macbeth. Since she's going to high school, where they pointlessly teach you about Macbeth, it makes sense that she knows this. The witches in that story must be really forgettable though. Maybe the witches in that story were forgettable because they're too cliché and one-dimensional. I hope the potion Hilda's brewing will actually be used in the story. Suddenly, Hilda serves Zelda some oatmeal, which disappoints her. Zelda says that from Shakespeare, she expected something more exotic. Hilda says amusingly that the supermarket doesn't carry any real delicacies like bat's tongue and lizard's tail. Then why didn't she go to the Witch Mart? Surely there'd be one in this comic universe too. She complains that nothing's the same, and she thinks the good old days are a thing of the past. Even though she's a woman, and sexism was a big thing back in the past. You'd think women would be the last people to be like this, especially since every version of Zelda and Hilda I'm familiar with grew up exclusively on Earth. So they probably did too. Hilda misses the fun she and Zelda used to have as wild, irresponsible teenagers, while she puts her hand on Zelda's shoulder. It's so weird that Zelda was an irresponsible teenager. I guess her being a no-fun control freak came out of nowhere to fans in the show. But it was a great idea to make her contrast Hilda. So far, all she is to me is a really quiet person. And apparently I have to assume that Hilda dragged her along and talked her into a bunch of mischief. Zelda says that was 300 years ago, and Hilda wants to go out and panic the neighbors. If she likes doing that without an excuse, why did she wait until now to go back to doing it? Sabrina screams and tells her no, and somehow has to remind her that witches are a minority group here and they shouldn't make things worse. Won't every witch that lives on Earth have had this drilled into their heads for their entire lives to keep it a secret? I guess not. It's so easy to forget that in the comics, witches always get away with using magic around mortals with no consequences. And you're forced to assume that spy witches behind surveillance camera footage erase mortal memories every single time. If that's the case in this comic, then no wonder witches stop caring about hiding magic. That does make me wonder why mortals are even aware of the idea of witches at all if their memories are wiped every time they saw them in action. Of course they're still allowed to think up witches as fictional characters. Zelda tells Hilda to cool it because she's upsetting Sabrina, who's crying, rather than simply using magic to try to stop Hilda, like trapping her in an ice cube. But if she did, she'd probably get grounded, so... And she's probably against using magic to brainwash her into changing her mind about this. Hilda puts her hand on Sabrina's shoulder, saying that she accepts Sabrina's way of life just fine. Ambrose asks Sabrina what she wants to do. Maybe the story should have started here. Sabrina explains that she wants to save up money to spend it on decorating her room, to make it a really cool teenage room. Hilda's much smarter than her by asking her why she wants to spend money instead of asking her to zap whatever she wants up. And Sabrina insists on doing things the normal way like normal people. I guess this is where the show got this from. The show seems a lot more faithful to the 71 comic than the comic released to promote it. Sabrina's like this, and her magic is more rare and usually backfires, like in the sitcom. If her magic usually backfires on her, then maybe that can be a good excuse for why she started insisting on doing things the normal way. She's learning her lesson. The problem is, she doesn't say that, and she's just going to the other extreme. She's not learning that some spells are too major to be allowed to work, like any spell that tries to change your status quo. But spells that make her life more convenient, like decorating her room, are not going to backfire on her. She uses magic without thinking all the time, so this seems out of character for her. Hilda tells her to do what she wants, and Sabrina thanks her, cheering up right away. Hilda has a good point making fun of Sabrina's stupidity, but I can imagine her being against magic is the same reason some people are against action replay. It just doesn't feel fulfilling to use G-codes. Zelda tells Hilda to stop sulking, and Ambrose tells her to leave Sabrina alone. Some good establishing character moments for them finally. It's odd that it took until the 4th issue for Zelda to have a personality. Hilda says that sulking is more becoming to a witch, and uses magic to splash Zelda with a bucket of water. She's fortunately called childish, but then says she didn't do it and puts the water back in the pail. She says she'll pour it in the sink, and it just spills on the floor. I sense some bullshit coming. Ambrose tries to do it and it spills on his head. Why would any of this happen? Why would it be so hard for anybody to imagine a bucket floating to a certain place, or its water going to a certain place? Is it Sabrina's fault? Zelda's magic sends a bucket through the window, and then Hilda screams at seeing Sabrina's room, and Ambrose and Zelda laugh. Ambrose explains that the pretty designs Sabrina brought for her room are all hex signs, which were painted on barns and houses to ward off witches and evil spirits. How would mere pictures made by mortals do that? The only way they could be magical is if 1. A witch casts a spell on each and every design that Sabrina bought to do that just out of spite for her fellow witches. Which, if we look at Hilda, I can't blame witches for. Or 2. A bunch of witches combined their powers to cast a spell, so that every time one of these designs would show up on Earth, they'd ruin all the spells in the house they're in. Again, Hilda perfectly demonstrates to us why a self-healing witch would exist. I wish that was explained. Because without it being explained, it's interesting, but stupid. The story ends with Betty and Veronica complimenting the decorations in their room. And we didn't have to deal with padding where we'd see them get the decorations. I guess Sabrina thought she'd get punished if she kept the decorations, which is why she got rid of them despite complaining about their magic. In the next story, Ambrose asks Sabrina if her friends ever suspect she's a witch. Why is he taking this so seriously? Magic use in front of mortals never has consequences in the Sabrina comics, and he should know that. Sabrina says that sometimes she's suspected, but she just laughs it off, and most people don't believe in them. Then we see Reggie, who calls himself smart, telling his friends that Sabrina has to be a witch. So, magic use isn't wiped from every mortal's memories? Maybe this happened really soon after he saw the evidence. And spy witches are always so overwhelmed with work because of people like Hilda that magic use isn't always wiped away from a mortal's memory right afterwards. And sometimes it can take a couple of days. It might also be assumed by the spy witches that, as we see here, it's okay to let some mortals remember witchcraft because no one believes them about it anyways. I assume the reason Reggie's suspicious is because he remembers witnessing acts of magic from Sabrina that Sabrina didn't know he witnessed, so she didn't know to erase it from his memory. But that should be explained. Just as I was wondering whether it was accurate to refer to Archie and so on as Reggie's friends, he calls them his friends, and Archie quips cleverly, "We didn't know you had any." I thought Reggie was a jock, a basketball player, so it surprised me that he said he had a superior brain too. Like, why would he ever say that when he's not Dilton? And he says it again. He says that he's gonna trick Sabrina into revealing her identity. If he was really smart, he'd know that a witch would be able to just erase his suspicion of her with a single point. I guess he's not afraid of Sabrina because he knows that she's a good person, which is why he doesn't think she'd abuse her magic against them. If he was really smart, he would leave it alone, and play dumb so he'd still remember, not try to pointlessly get Sabrina in trouble. Is he just jealous of her magic? He certainly doesn't seem afraid of her, like you'd expect. I guess we're supposed to think he's not actually smart, since he's bragging. And that's a common thing in fiction. But Rick Sanchez brags all the time, and he does live up to his bragging. And Reggie bragged about being great at basketball, and he lived up to it. I thought Dilton was the smart one, so you'd think he would fit this role better. It's good to have multiple characters have a personality trait instead of all having one. Sabrina doesn't question Reggie calling her my sweet, and he asks her to define a witch, while hitting Archie with his elbow. Well, I guess the reason I'm not mad at him is that Archie treats Betty too badly and is kind of a loser. Sabrina messes with Reggie by stalling, defining the word witch instead of just describing a stereotypical witch, like saying they have green skin, which would throw him off. Ambrose messes with him as well by joining in with the dictionary, dragging out the joke to an entire page. Then it's revealed that Sabrina takes top honors in English grammar. Ambrose reads the dictionary definition of a witch, which says that a witch has power through contact with evil spirits. Let me look this up. I just googled it and got to Merriam-Webster. A person, especially a woman, who is credited with having usually malignant supernatural powers. No mention of evil spirits. There is a second definition that mentions with the aid of a devil or familiar, but it says often with, not always with the aid. I'm sure the reason evil spirits are omitted from the modern definition, even if maybe it was the case in the 70s, is that modern pop culture never portrays witches as having to use a devil or familiars, like Harry Potter and Sabrina. because it just requires an extra filler character to hang around the witch all the time. We've never seen Sabrina's family interacting with spirits. Sabrina tells Ambrose in a panic that they never reveal that secret. Is she just acting to mess with Reggie? Because why would she be panicked when she should know he can erase people's memories anyways? Ambrose uses a memory spell to push the reset button on Reggie, and Sabrina explains that it was just playing games with them. Why did he have to say evil spirit if not to say that Sabrina isn't a witch because she doesn't make contact with them? The comic needs to establish that the definition he read was wrong, or it might create the wrong impression about them. He sure did waste a lot of pages on us because he didn't use that spell right away. I have to wonder why he worried about Sabrina's friends knowing she's a witch if anyone can just do this. It seems like a waste of a plot that he uses the memory spell so quickly. You'd think the whole point of writing this kind of plot would be that we'd see what would actually happen if they found out she was a witch. And the second they could freak out and want to take advantage of her, then you could have him use memory spells. What's the point of a story like this? Especially since Reggie didn't even say what specific incidents made him suspicious of Sabrina. In the next story, Sabrina wakes up stretching and says that this is a beautiful day, and she's gonna spend it by having fun with the gang. Then a woman with a great design tells her while in the reflection of her mirror for the sake of looking memorable, that they've had enough of that sort of thing. So this is the first appearance of Della the head witch. They really wanted to switch things up for no reason by making Della just a secretary in the 90s comic, without even a passing mention of the idea that she used to be head witch herself. It's really confusing that Sabrina's being told off for a goody-goody attitude and friendliness, when most people would want that, and the witches look like people. And the entire comic up to this point has been telling me that this is the way of the future with witches. But apparently the head witch is old-fashioned. It's so weird to see Sabrina insulted for being a good person. Maybe what's going on is that witches think they're better than mortals. Of course, because they have powers. So the racism against them means that Sabrina is expected to treat them like dirt. But she's not mentioning mortals here. She's talking as if witches in general aren't allowed to be friendly. No society ever would discourage good behavior. Laws would be broken all over the place. No functional society would actually work like that. It's like the comic is referencing the fact that witches in the media are known for being evil. But it's mortals who know them for being evil. Only the witches who live on Earth would have to deal with that expectation and want to live up to it. The comic is using the fact that witches are known for being evil, but we already know that Sabrina isn't evil. Having Sabrina be the exception in Universe 2 makes things even more confusing, because why is she the exception then? The comic was giving the impression by humanizing witches through her that most witches aren't actually all bad. It feels like it defeats the purpose of the comic and what made it so creative and refreshing if it's trying to tell us that no, most witches are still evil, when that makes no sense. It does make sense that a lot of people would not be able to control themselves and lash out with magic if they can, but still, it seems like Della is forcing witches to be like this, by stealing their powers if they're too nice. I wasn't expecting Sabrina to be happy about this at all. I guess I'm too used to the 90s comic where she made sense. Instead, she hugs her and thanks her because she wants to be normal instead of feeling like she's not a real part of her group of friends. If she was really smart, she'd control herself and not make it clear to Della that she's not really punishing her. She's just begging her to give her a different punishment, like change her into a frog. Enchantress was all about turning people to animals. But instead, we don't even get to see her lose her powers, bafflingly. And she runs away saying she's free, as Della's just confused. It makes sense if Sabrina said that rather than just wanting to be normal, she's just sick of magic always backfiring on her. Hilda has to explain to her what Sabrina clearly spelled out for her, and Della says she'll give her powers back because she can't let Sabrina be just like mortals either. Why didn't she try to do that on her own? Instead, the rest of the plot happens because she happens to only do this in front of Hilda. It would have made sense if Hilda had been written to go into Sabrina's room while Della was there because she heard talking in it. So then she could be with her right when Sabrina would lose her powers. I mean, wasn't it obvious to Della that she would be just like mortals if she made her immortal? Hilda suggested Della giving Sabrina's powers to her backwards. Hilda says that Sabrina was misusing her powers by doing good deeds for her mortal friends. She really is racist against mortals. Della agrees to make sure that all of Sabrina's good deeds will turn out bad. So I guess this works by Della placing a curse on her that overrides her own magic. Placing a bit of Della's magic in her body so it would know what spell she was trying to cast. I feel sorry for Sabrina here. It's nice of Della to say that this idea might earn Hilda the Golden Broom at the awards next month. She's showing appreciation for someone, even if it's for the wrong reason. I just wish I understood why Della was like this, because it's really confusing. I don't think even a bad upbringing would explain this, and she's not loud and melodramatic and wacky enough for me to dismiss her as just crazy and that's why she's like that, like Zim. I gotta respect the writers of these comics on being able to come up with good rhymes for spells so often. I find it pretty tedious to do and just skip it entirely. We see Betty being mad at Reggie outside, as Veronica references that a frog was put in her handbag, and Reggie wrote his name on her lawn in super strength grass food. This takes a while, but it's supposed to explain why it won't come out of nowhere to people unfamiliar with Reggie that he's gonna pull a prank on Sabrina. Betty wonders what rotten trick Reggie will play on Sabrina. Won't Sabrina hear that? She's just a couple feet away. She wonders if Della didn't take away her powers. She would never think that. She uses magic to try to steer a baseball away from Reggie's hair, and it hits his head, giving it a bump. You know, I would have found it more satisfying if, instead, Reggie pranked her, like was clearly foreshadowed. It was a twist that Reggie didn't even get to pull a prank on her. But then the only point of all that talk about him being a prankster before this, since it led to nothing, was that it made sure we wouldn't feel sorry for Reggie here. But that makes Sabrina's pity for him alienating. I already hated Reggie from the previous issues. I wish it was explained why he's such a jerk, like he has really bad parents. Sabrina tries to make Reggie unhurt, but all this does is smack him around as if he's being attacked by someone invisible. Betty says it's like a dream come true. While I agree, I thought she was supposed to be the 100% nice one. Who is she then? Archie and Veronica know that Sabrina's responsible for this, and compliment her enthusiastically. But shouldn't they be freaked out and know she's a witch? Reggie was slammed into the ground back and forth by someone invisible, and yet they're not admitting to Reggie that he was right all along about her. Veronica calls Sabrina the personal jinx of Reggie, after one time something bad happened to him around her. Wouldn't this be far from the only time she would have abused magic against him? Hilda sees Sabrina being carried by her friends outside of her window, and Hilda somehow gets away with telling Dilla that she's slipping and should check in at the head office for a refresher course. Wait, the word ends there. That's actually the end of the story? I hope it continues on to story arc, because come on, how could the story end there? How could this curse not have permanent consequences? If the head witch undid her spell on Sabrina because she naturally thought she screwed it up, then we should have seen that for a proper ending. You'd think she would try again later. We see a comedy page where Zelda, with the differently colored hat from her dress, tells Harvey not to play that guitar or those wild records this morning and keep away from Hilda. She knows this is going to be one of her bad days, even though she hasn't gotten out of bed yet. Zelda says that she can tell by the way she destroyed her alarm clock. That panel seems familiar. I wonder if I saw this page before. I've seen a few stories from the 71 comic in my childhood too. Then there's another comedy page. Usually these haven't made me laugh, but it's worth it to see another chapter in the life of Sabrina. Sabrina tells Harvey to be quiet because Hilda's exhausted on the armchair from a busy day. Harvey considerately asks what she had been doing, and Sabrina explains that she was at the beauty parlor for almost 3.5 hours. I expected him to ask why she's exhausted then. It'd be the people working at the parlor who'd be doing all the work, right? Instead, Harvey naturally says, too bad she wasn't waited on. And the story ends before we could see Hilda punish him. He's still a sympathetic character because he was being honest, not trying to insult her. Then there's a third comedy page, where we see Harvey doing a handstand on the floor with the lampshade over his head while holding something. I'm glad this comic cares enough to change the clothes of every character on a regular basis. Anyways, Sabrina says that Harvey's just doing his thing, and Harvey says that this is how the new generation works. And they tell it like it is. Try doing that nowadays without getting insulted en masse for stating her opinion. Was this really how it was in the 70s? Harvey tells Hilda, I wonder why he's dangerously balancing a lamp on his head and stupidly risking its destruction like a jerk, that if you have the feeling you want to do something, just do it. That's crazy. Hilda naturally likes this idea because she's evil, so she kicks him out of the house. Although we don't get to see her do that. Then in another page, Hilda asks where Sabrina's going looking like that. I assume she's getting mad at Sabrina for being skimpily dressed, because she's old-fashioned and obviously not the target audience for the whole appeal of that. Sabrina calls her outfit the latest fashion trend, hot pants. But Hilda insists on making her wear an ugly, bright yellow shirt with a bow on it, and strictly throws her pants in the fire, making them literally hot. Meanwhile, Sabrina's legs are still showing. So, was this really just about the specific outfit? We see another page, where Sabrina tells Harvey that she thinks he picked up a nail in his dune buggy tire. She already pulled it out, and now all the air will leak out of the hole. She tells Harvey later that she put it back and he had nothing to worry about. He asks her how she ever found the hole again, and she says that it wasn't easy. Huh? What's the joke? She put too many nails in the tire? Wouldn't she have just used her magic to instantly fix the tire instead of risking damaging it with tons of nails? I'm a girl too, but I'd never do something like this. It's just Sabrina in particular being dumb, I'm sure. So far I haven't seen Sabrina at high school at all, when that was a staple of the 90s comic and sitcom. And that helped really make it feel like a comic version of the show when I look back on it. But it's actually more exciting and interesting to have the comic be this way, because it feels like a new experience. It means that I never know what kind of story I'm gonna see. That always applied, because of the episodic nature of the series, but still, it's not like I'd ever get bored because I assume it's just gonna be another story where she goes to school and uses their magic to make a typical mundane problem there go away. Usually she's either at home with her aunts, or on a walk. And apparently every teenager we see is really into the exercise because they're always walking too. She doesn't have to be a teenager for stories that don't take place in high school. Then there's a story, finally. Sabrina tells Hilda that she's been invited to go sailing. Hilda's upset that she'd prefer to spend time with youngsters that are strange to her over going with her own aunts to open their cottage on Casket Island. Zelda tells her to let her go, saying that she's only young once. Technically, she could just turn herself young again with magic later. It seems like there's the strict aunt and the lenient aunt, who you'd expect to be Hilda. Then the next panel doesn't have Sabrina in it. So apparently the story cut past Hilda letting Sabrina go. Hilda creates a continuity error by saying that she thinks colors like red, green, yellow, and blue are ugly. I know that Hilda's worn blue before, and yet Zelda agrees. Is this intentional hypocritical humor? Because it wasn't funny. Fortunately, Hilda explains what colors she does like. Gray, violet, mauve, and green. This is more development than the Sonic characters ever get. What's Bunny's favorite color? It sure was nice of Hilda to allow Sabrina to go where she wants. I thought she wouldn't. She says she's off to the island to improve the cottage for the stormy weekends she enjoys so much. Lightning can't strike through the roof of a house if it's flimsy enough, like the roofs of older houses. You'd think witches raised on Earth would be terrified of stormy weather. Well, no, because I'm sure they could just cast a spell so that the roof would be immune to lightning. Never mind. It's a good thing the comic's really interesting so that I can stay invested and engaged in it in spite of its plot holes. Hilda flies away on a broom, while hoping that airplanes stay out of her flight path today. It makes sense that witches wouldn't bother to make airplanes when they could just teleport and fly themselves. Just as I was thinking about how likely it'd be that someone would see a witch flying on a broomstick, this very thing happens. Not that it matters. I guess the reason witches don't lose their powers for stuff like this is that magic is so tempting that if every witch was punished for exposing magic by losing their powers, then no witch on Earth would have powers anymore. And witches are probably so proud of their magic that they think that would be unacceptable. We see Sabrina on a sailboat, saying that she loves this, and thanks Archie and Jughead for letting her tag along. Archie responds politely, and then they want to head in because there's storm clouds out. I've already seen a story where one of the main characters went sailing, and there was a storm out in the 90s comic. The sailboat gets tossed and battered, and by coincidence so coincidental that it took me out of the story, their boat gets brought to Casket Island, which could have been anywhere, like in the other realm. There could have been near any other island. I didn't know where the island would be. Hopefully this will be interesting enough to be worth it. Betty says this island's spooky, and Sabrina says it's not so bad. Jughead points out that while all the other islands have seagulls, this one only has bats and vultures. Archie says they're all in danger, as I start to wonder if it's legal for a bunch of teenagers to go sailing in a boat unsupervised, because this kind of thing could happen. Sabrina says that Archie's going to need help, And I wish she was written to merely think or spell instead of say it. And in a screaming text bubble at that. Because now I'm wondering why none of her friends will hear her and figure out she's a witch who put the boat ashore. Everyone was able to hear each other in the storm just fine before this point. So why would the storm only now be too loud for them to hear Sabrina? The boat heads towards the island, and Hilda doesn't want the people on the boat to bother her, so she casts a spell to make it turn around and sail back to sea, because she's too far away to see who the people are. I can't help but find it amusing because she doesn't know that's Sabrina. Sabrina uses magic to force the boat back onto the beach, and naturally her friends don't know how that happened. I guess they lost their memory of this afterwards. Meanwhile, Hilda sees what happened and figures out that Sabrina's here. Sabrina says to her friends that she knows the old lady who lives on the island and wants to get her help. Hilda calls her friends pests for some reason. I can understand Harvey, but I wish I knew why she was insulting the rest. She complains that Sabrina should have friends in the witch group instead. Sabrina calls her out, and Hilda complains that Sabrina can't be reasoned with and has good companions. She's like Mama Robotnik, wanting her kid to be evil somehow. How does she not realize that if she was evil, she'd make her life miserable? That's why it makes no sense for most witches to want to be evil. It inconvenienced them if people were like that. Out of nowhere, some guy breaks to someone that Hilda doesn't know the value of this place called Casket Island, and has been making a mistake trusting him to pay her taxes for years. And she lost it last week, and he picked it up for peanuts at the county tax sale. Mr. Sleazy plans on throwing Hilda off the island and putting up a class resort to make millions. There's no real tension here because Hilda's a witch. I guess he plans on renaming the island for marketability purposes. Archie shows morality, wanting to help Hilda, and Jughead wants to follow the crooks. Meanwhile, Hilda tells Mr. Sleazy already that he double-crossed her out of the island in a way that she admires. Then Sabrina's friends burst into the place, saying that any aunt of hers is their friend. This really should endear them to Hilda. Mr. Sleazy dares to call them hoodlums, when he's called Mr. Sleazy, and threatens to have the law on them for attacking him. Archie bravely says he'll take that chance, and Jughead says that he heard him confess to robbing Hilda of her property. Sabrina decides to meddle with her magic to prevent the boys from getting themselves in trouble. She casts a spell to make the boys seem like monsters to the bad guys. Won't everyone hear her say this and turn around and face her right away? She should have just had a thought bubble. So Mr. Sleazy, who I guess gave himself that name as a self-aware, proud nickname, tells Hilda to call them off and says he'll do whatever she says. He says he'll assign the ownership of the island back to her. Hilda would have looked proactive if she had used her magic against them to defend herself like I was expecting from her. But that'd be too predictable compared to a twist like this, which is more interesting, and has the main character's Sabrina savor. Hilda's proud of Sabrina, not that she says this to her unfortunately. And Archie and Jughead are proud of themselves. Jughead says he's hungry, and Betty tells Hilda that this is delicious, and says that she's one of the good ones. But why would she say that specific phrase if she doesn't know that Hilda's any kind of minority, let alone a witch? I guess she meant good person, but why didn't she say that? The only way this would make sense is if she did know she was a witch, but I doubt that was the intent. The story actually ends with Hilda making food and complaining that now Sabrina's got her doing good deeds. Which makes sense because she just got flattered for cooking skills. The first story had Sabrina complain that she wants to be normal and decorate her room the mortal way. And it turns out the designs she bought end up being hexes, ruining the spells of everyone in the house. It's interesting, but it's not explained how that's possible when she bought them from Earth. The second story confuses me by not explaining why Reggie's able to remember the evidence that Sabrina's a witch, when clearly no one has to have the ability to remember that, or the status quo won't remain a thing. Why would only Reggie know? She makes herself so obvious. So Ambrose wastes a whole story on us instead of just erasing Reggie's memory right away. But at least it does a good job establishing his character. He decides to have fun with Reggie, because he's smart enough to realize that he can just erase his memory anyways. The third story is about Della the head witch, having somehow heard that Sabrina's friendly, when we don't see any other witches than Sabrina's family, punishing her by taking away her powers, just to be convinced by Hilda to give them back, but make them do evil instead. This makes Sabrina hurt Reggie, the perfect person for it. But because she's carried and congratulated for it, when you think to be too busy panicking about the fact that she's magical instead, Della thinks her spell didn't work. And somehow that's the end of the story and things are back to normal afterwards. When this is a story about the head witch removing her powers and then cursing her. I just spent the story confused that Della would want to punish someone for being nice instead of encouraging it to have a functional society where people don't want to break the law all the time. This is the biggest problem with the comic. This is the one thing that I always remember. And the fourth story is about Hilda going to a cottage on her island for no reason. And Sabrina's sailboat has to go there because of a storm that was foreshadowed, which seems cliche. And then Sabrina's friends get mad at someone for trying to steal Hilda's island on her. I guess it was an uninhabited island that no one actually owned, and that's how Hilda came to own it. And it's because she's been alive for so long. Instead of Hilda handling it herself like I expected, there was a twist where Sabrina did instead, in an indirect way by making her friends look like monsters Mr. Sleazy. So that was more clever than her using magic on Mr. Sleazy directly. I guess Hilda was planning on defending herself with her magic, but Sabrina did it first. That would make sense. I didn't even expect Sabrina to go to that island. So that might be the best story in the issue. Like the two characters met each other. It wasn't really confusing, and it had a legitimate twist. Though she should have had to erase her friends' memories after she made the sailboat turn around to get back to the island.